In 1814, the house by the Connecticut River looked honest from the road. A white face with pond-green shutters and a roof that held its secrets under tight shingles. The sort of place that made a passer-by breathe easier without knowing why. Isaac Lowell stood on the step with a leather book pressed against his ribs and a mild smile that never changed from market day to market day. The calm face of a man who measured his life the same way he measured grain. Eleanor, pale and careful, moved the children through the doorway as if guiding them past a line the town could not see, touching each shoulder with a steady hand, counting without numbers. The river worried the bank and made the air damp even on clear mornings, so the house always smelled of lye and wet wood, clean in a way that felt like warning. When the church bell drifted over the fields on Sundays, the Lowells stopped working and bowed their heads where they stood, and neighbors took that as respect, even as they noticed the family never walked the lane to the green, never brought a baby to the font, never left a name in the parish book. Isaac gave plain answers when asked, weather words and health words, nothing to hold, then shut the door with a soft click that sounded practiced. He kept a neat life that cut the day into pieces and stacked them tight. At dawn, he walked the boundary and tapped each fence post, counted his steps to the barn and back, then opened the leather book and made a mark before anyone else spoke. At noon, he latched the windows even in heat, drew the curtains and turned the rooms into thin shade. Eleanor lit a single candle and taught the children to hold their breath until the flame steadied, calling it a lesson in patience. Visitors who left eggs or thread on the stoop said the floors were scrubbed to the grain, and the chairs were spaced like measures on a staff, precise enough to be music if someone dared to play. Under the stairs, a small bell hung from a leather thong. Every evening Isaac struck it once, and the sound went into the walls and did not come back. Children from the river road pressed their faces to the shutters and said they saw only themselves looking in. But one swore he heard counting, the patient rhythm of feet that never moved. Inside, order took the shape of prayer. Spoons always pointed north, chairs faced east. On the mantel lay a slim line of ash that Eleanor smoothed each morning with 2 fingers before touching each child's tongue. A quiet smear they swallowed without complaint. She told them silence keeps the body safe and that noise invites hunger. And they believed her because nothing in the house ever broke. Isaac ruled with small acts that looked like care. He cut bread into equal squares and watched the children eat in a rhythm he could name. He lined their shoes heel to toe and rubbed the leather with tallow until they shone like river stones. He never raised a hand, preferring the weight of his palm on a shoulder and the pause that followed, as if he were listening for something under the skin. At night he moved from room to room with the leather book and a quill, writing by candle the way a man mends net, knot by knot, mark by mark, until a shape could hold. Sometimes he stood at the cellar door and warmed the key in his fist until the metal printed a pale crescent in his palm, then hung it back on its hook as if the lesson belonged to him first. The river did its slow work beyond the fields, pulling earth away and laying it down again. People said the Lowells had luck with rot. Their beams stayed sound, their grain stayed dry, their children did not cough in winter. When baptisms were held in town, the family stood in their yard facing the water while Eleanor pressed her thumbs to the small bones in each wrist and spoke to them in a voice like counting. By winter, the neighbors had stopped asking about Sundays. They waved from the road and kept walking, comforted by neatness even as it scraped at something soft inside them. And from the dark glass of the upstairs window, the children watched their own faces float while candles burned down to cups of wax and the bell waited under the stairs. And Isaac opened his book to begin the order that would guide them all. The ledger was not hidden but placed on the highest shelf, spine cracked with years of opening and closing, a book so ordinary that visitors never asked to touch it. Isaac Lowell treated it as a living thing. setting it down on the table with both hands, smoothing the leather as if calming a restless animal. The children knew better than to glance too long at its pages, though sometimes in candlelight they saw the faint red of numbers written too hard, ink sunk deep into paper fibers. To them it was a calendar, though not of harvest or season, but of the body itself. Each child's birthday was written not with a name, but with a symbol, a circle or a cross, a jagged line that looked like a cut. Above each mark stood the date, carefully measured, and beneath it a note of silence. Sometimes a single stroke, sometimes a cluster that spread like veins. No prayer accompanied these entries, no scripture. Only order, precise and merciless. On nights when the river swelled, Isaac sat at the long table and weighed the quill in his hand, as if it were a blade. He dipped it slowly, watched the ink bleed across the edge of the glass bottle, then made his marks with the care of a surgeon cutting flesh. The house grew still when the scratching began, Eleanor holding the children in their chairs until the sound stopped. She told them it was their father setting the measure of their lives, and they must be grateful he kept account, for numbers could not lie and people always did. The children nodded, though their stomachs knotted at the rhythm of quill against paper. To them the sound was not writing but carving, a chisel pressing deeper into wood that would one day break. The ledger thickened with years. Some pages curled with dried wax where candles had guttered too low. Others bore smears of salt as though damp hands had pressed them shut in haste. But most were clean, white as bone, the black marks standing out like wounds. Each new year brought a new entry, the same ritual repeated. At dawn, Isaac would ring the small bell under the stairs, gather the family around the table, and open the ledger with deliberate care. The chosen child stood stiff as he touched the mark beside their date, tracing it once with the quill, then again with the tip of his finger. He said nothing, only closed the book and pressed it to his chest. Afterward, the family ate bread in silence, chewing until their jaws ached, never speaking until the bell was struck again. No one outside the house ever knew how often the ledger was open. Neighbors who borrowed tools or seeds said Isaac kept fine records of trade, neat rows of figures they envied, though they never noticed the blank pages between. He showed them only what was safe, the columns of debts and oaths, while hiding the darker tally deeper inside. For Isaac, the ledger was not a record but a covenant. Each mark stood for a life bound to his order, each date a reminder that time moved according to his design. The children belonged not to the church, not to heaven, but to the numbers that bound them. He believed the world could be corrected through counting, that every soul was a weight that could be measured and balanced if set against silence. At night, when all the house was still, Eleanor sometimes heard him whisper over the pages, not prayers but fragments of numbers repeated again and again like a chant with no melody. She watched from the shadows as his lips moved, the quill scratching and pausing, scratching again. His eyes gleamed with the fever of certainty, the quiet joy of a man who believed he alone had seen the hidden pattern. She never asked what the symbols meant, though she pressed the children's hands harder during their lessons by candle, teaching them to breathe without sound, to swallow words before they rose. She knew the ledger was not just Isaac's work. It was a mirror of the house itself, and of the lives drawn thinner each year. By the time the first child's entry bore not just a mark but a second line beneath it, the family had already stopped walking into town. No one noticed the silence they carried back to the river. Only the house did, its walls holding the scratch of ink, the hush of breath, the weight of numbers that grew heavier with each page turned. The ledger sat waiting, a book of silence that spoke only to Isaac, its spine growing softer, its marks more cruel, its purpose still hidden but certain, like a shadow that lengthens even when the sun is gone. The storm came hard in the summer of 1822, rain hurling itself sideways against the clapboard walls, wind tearing branches from the riverbank trees. Neighbors who hurried lanterns along the lane swore they heard not just the storm, but another sound carrying from the Lowell house, thin and sharp, the kind of wail that rose above thunder only because it came from the throat of a child. They lingered at the gate, half blinded by sheets of rain, certain the cries came from within, but Isaac never opened the door and Eleanor never raised a lamp. By morning the house looked undisturbed, shutters drawn, smoke rising from the chimney as though nothing had passed. The neighbors shook their heads, told themselves the storm had twisted their hearing, but a week later Nathaniel, the youngest boy, was gone. Isaac said nothing more than that the child had been taken back, his words clipped and final, as though the matter belonged to no one else. The parish made no entry, no burial was recorded, and after a few weeks the town allowed the silence to settle over the river again. For decades the house stood with its secret sealed in timber. Isaac's ledger grew heavier with marks while the rooms remained unchanged, chairs in their lines, candles burning down to wax pools on the mantel. The wall in the north chamber looked like any other. Plaster smooth, paint worn by years of hands passing close. It would not yield its truth until long after the family was gone, when men with chisels and crowbars came to renovate what was left. They struck the plaster, expecting dust and lath, and instead uncovered a cavity hollowed with deliberate care. Inside, curled against the studs, lay the small frame of a boy, bones bound tight with cords of woven horsehair. The skull tilted sideways, jaw locked as if in the middle of a cry. Alongside the skeleton were scraps of paper, browned and brittle with age, pressed flat against the wood. The ink still clung faint but legible. Lines of a hymn, the words broken, unfinished, written in a child's shaky hand. Some letters were smudged as though traced with tears, others cut off mid-stroke, the quill taken before the line could end. The workers who found it lowered their tools, unable to speak, for the room seemed to thicken with the echo of what had once been silenced. They carried the remains into the light, but the air around them stayed heavy, as though the cries from that storm had been caught in the timber and had never stopped. The discovery was noted, murmured about in the town, but no record tied it back to Isaac's ledger. No law demanded justice for bones decades cold. The hymn scraps vanished into private hands, then whispered over but never kept in any archive. What remained was the cavity itself, a wound in the house that refused to close, proof that the silence Isaac Lowell worshipped had been bought with the slow breaking of his own child. The wall stood open for a time before the builders covered it again, plastering over the gap, yet even sealed it seemed to breathe, carrying forward the memory of the boy who had once cried loud enough to pierce a storm, only to be swallowed by the order of his father's house. When dusk fell over the Lowell house, Eleanor began her prayers. Not in the language of the parish, not with scripture or song, but with fire. She moved slowly through the room, striking flint again and again until each corner glowed with the yellow pulse of flame. Dozens of candles stood ready, lined on mantels, sills, and shelves. Their wicks stiffened not with wax, but with the fat she rendered from livestock in secret kettles. The air grew heavy, thick with a smell that clung to the walls, a sweetness that soured the longer it burned. To a passerby, the glow might have looked holy, a family's evening devotion, but inside it was a ritual stripped of mercy, carried out with precision and rule. The children were summoned barefoot to the center of the room, their small bodies ringed by firelight. Eleanor told them this was their silence hour, the time when voices must die so their souls would not be corrupted. She held each wrist in turn, guided their hands above the flames until the heat licked at skin and did not let go until the flesh began to redden. Blisters rose quickly in the glow, swelling like unspoken words. and the children bit their lips until they bled, swallowing cries that would have broken the rule. Eleanor whispered that only burning flesh could draw sin out, that noise fed it, and that silence made them clean again. They believed her because she never flinched, because she too pressed her palms above the fire and let them crack and harden until they shone like scar tissue. Night after night the same order played out. The candles guttered low, wax pooling on the floorboards like melted bone. Eleanor's face glistened in the flicker, her eyes wide, fixed on something beyond the children, something she alone seemed to see. Isaac watched from the threshold, ledger clutched in his hands, making marks as each child endured their trial. He never spoke, but his breathing deepened when one faltered, as though failure itself proved the necessity of his count. Eleanor whispered verses of her own making, words that braided pain with salvation, promising that each blister was a seal against corruption. She told them scars were marks of obedience, proof the world's hunger could not enter them. The house smelled always of smoke and fat, even by morning when the windows were unlatched to the river breeze. Neighbors commented on the scent when they came near the yard, assuming it was soap or meat left to cool. But no one stepped inside to see the wax trails hardened into strange shapes, or the small pale burns that bloomed across the children's hands. The little ones tucked their fingers into sleeves, hid the pain as they had been taught, carrying it like a secret prayer that would one day save them. Eleanor's voice echoed longest in their ears, her whisper that silence itself was holy. That fire was the only baptism left unspoiled. And so each evening they returned to the circle of flames, trembling, obedient, certain that their mother's night prayers were the only shield between them and damnation, even as the skin of their hands told another truth entirely, one that burned and scarred and could never be undone. Water was forbidden in the Lowell house. To wash was permitted, to drink was necessary. But to bless with water was called corruption. Eleanor said the river itself was poisoned with falsehood, that the church had drowned truth beneath its surface, and so she built her own sacrament of heat. When a child reached the age she named, the family gathered in the cellar where the stone walls held no sound. The floor was spread with coarse salt, sharp crystals scattered until it glittered under the lamplight. The child was ordered to kneel upon it, bare legs pressed down until the skin split and bled in tiny lines. The others were forced to watch, told that each drop was proof of devotion, that flesh itself must open before the soul could be sealed. Eleanor moved with ritual care, setting aside a basin that held no water, only a long iron rod left in the embers until it glowed. She called it the true font, the only vessel untouched by lies. When she lifted it free, the heat warped the air, and her eyes fixed on the trembling child as if she were midwife to a second birth. Isaac stood behind her, ledger in hand, marking time by breath, recording each shudder. When the moment came, Eleanor pressed the metal to the child's shoulder, skin searing in an instant, smoke curling upward like a prayer denied. The child did not scream, for screaming was forbidden, but the sound clawed in their throat until it became a dry, choking sob, swallowed to please the order. Eleanor whispered that the mark would stay when words were gone, that this was the only baptism God could not erase. The ritual left scars shaped not by chance but by intent. Some bore circles, others lines, each pattern chosen to mirror the marks in Isaac's ledger. The children compared them in silence, hiding them beneath cloth, ashamed yet bound together in their pain. Salt scabs hardened on their knees, the burns crusted black before healing into pale maps across their skin. They walked the yard stiffly for days, and neighbors who saw their awkward movements blamed winter chill or poor boots, never guessing the true cause. The house itself reeked of scorched fat and iron, but to those outside it was only the smell of work, nothing that stirred alarm. Those who survived into adulthood spoke later, their words trembling even after decades, of the way Eleanor's face shone in the glow of the rod, her mouth moving in murmurs that had no scripture but carried the weight of certainty. They said she believed herself to be cleansing what water had failed, that she trusted pain more than grace, silence more than song. And so the children knelt again and again, baptisms of heat repeated until obedience lived deeper than bone. It was not a single wound, but a lifetime of scars that marked them as Lowell children, proof that their bodies had been written into Isaac's ledger through Eleanor's hand, proof that silence had been carved into them by fire. By 1826, the Lowell name had already grown uneasy in the town. The neighbors could not say why exactly, only that the family seemed thinner each year, its children fewer at the window. 3 had gone missing by then, and not one burial had been seen. Isaac and Eleanor spoke of it with a strange calm, telling those who dared to ask that the children had been taken back. They never said by whom. Some thought they meant illness, others that they meant God himself, reclaiming what was never theirs to raise. But no grave was dug, no service was held, no record appeared in the parish. The children were there one day and gone the next, as if erased by an unseen hand. The silence around their absence became its own presence, a heaviness in the air that clung to the house and seeped into the soil by the river. The neighbors noticed the pattern even before they spoke of it aloud. The missing children had all reached certain ages, 9, 11, 13. They remembered the small bodies walking stiffly after Eleanor's night prayers, the way Isaac pressed his hand to each shoulder during harvest suppers, lingering too long as though measuring bone beneath the skin. When questions arose, Isaac's eyes never flickered. He only touched the leather ledger at his side and said that God requires order. No one dared ask what he meant, but some swore they heard scratching from inside the house at night, a quill moving long after the candles burned low, keeping track of something that did not belong to paper. The ledger itself, though hidden from the town, told the story with precision. Each vanished child had a mark beneath their birthday, a symbol written darker than the rest. First a circle, then a cross, then a jagged line. The entries stopped abruptly after each disappearance, as if the page had been closed to seal the matter. Eleanor's hand added her own sign in wax drips and smears of salt pressed flat into the margins. These were not errors, but deliberate seals, meant to keep the silence unbroken. Together, husband and wife had made record of what was never to be spoken aloud. In the weeks after each vanishing, the house fell into ritual even heavier than before. Eleanor lit more candles, lined them along the stairs and windows until the glass glowed like fire from within. She pressed the surviving children into the cellar, making them kneel in salt until their legs went numb, whispering that heaven had taken their brother or sister because the order had been kept. She said obedience could not be buried in earth, that the soul carried it away, and the children learned not to ask which of them would be next. They counted years in fear rather than hope, watching the ledger open on their birthdays with dread that the mark already written there might soon claim them. By the end of summer in 1826, the house felt empty, though laughter had never been allowed there. Only the sound of the bell under the stairs remained, struck by Isaac with the same steady hand, as though nothing had changed. Yet everyone in town knew something had. When the family walked the lane, fewer children followed, their eyes lowered, their hands scarred. No one challenged the Lowells openly, for the family's face was still one of piety, order, and discipline. But behind shutters the whispers grew. 3 children gone, 3 ages marked, taken back, they said. Taken back, as if heaven were not a gift but a ledger closing its pages one by one until nothing remained but silence. In 1831, years after the first Lowell child was swallowed into silence, The parish was sorting its records in a damp back room of the rectory. Mold crept along the spines of forgotten books, ledgers stacked like gravestones on wooden shelves. Among them, the officials found a volume that did not belong. Its leather was worn smooth by constant handling, the edges darkened with the oils of a single man's hands. Inside, the script was unmistakably Isaac Lowell's, rigid, deliberate, each stroke pressed deep as though the quill were carving rather than writing. At first, the parish assumed it to be an account of tithes or grain, until the symbols revealed themselves. Circles, crosses, jagged strokes, each paired with dates. No names appeared, only numbers, but the rhythm of the entries was precise enough to suggest lives counted and measured with grim devotion. The officials frowned at the strange marks, puzzled by their repetition. They noticed how each set of entries stopped abruptly, a gap in the flow as though something had ended. When they compared the dates to parish memory, a cold realization spread. The gaps matched the years when the Lowell children had vanished, and the numbers beside them corresponded to ages: 9, 11, 13. What unsettled them further was that the pattern extended beyond the Lowell family. In neighboring villages, orphans had disappeared at those same thresholds, their absences brushed aside by poverty and neglect. No one had thought to connect them until Isaac's ledger forced the alignment into view. The book was not a diary but an order, a structure that claimed dominion beyond its walls. Isaac had not been content to measure only his own blood. He had turned the practice outward, weaving strangers into his system as though their lives could be tallied the same way. Each mark was proof of his conviction that obedience could be recorded into silence, that ages themselves were thresholds where the body must be sealed or surrendered. The parish clerk sat in the flickering light of a single candle, listening to the wind press against the shutters, and felt the weight of the discovery sink into them like lead. The pattern was too precise to be chance, too cruel to be coincidence. Yet fear governed the next steps. Rather than confront the Lowells, the officials slipped the ledger back onto the shelf, telling themselves they would raise the matter later, that more pressing records needed tending. But the knowledge did not fade. Whispers crept through the parish like smoke, shaping rumors that spread from lane to lane. Mothers clutched their children tighter, forbidding them to stray near the river house. Farmers spoke of footprints leading nowhere, of children last seen at dusk who never returned. Each story folded itself into the pattern, even when no one dared to name it aloud. The numbers in the ledger became more than marks on a page. They were an infection of thought. Once seen, they could not be unseen. The officials who found the book dreamt of them, circles and crosses burning behind their eyes, each shape a measure of a life cut short. In town, candles guttered during services, leaving shadows across the pews where children once sat. It was as if the silence Isaac had carved into his own family had slipped past the walls of his house and now settled over the parish itself, an invisible order dictating who was spared and who was erased. What began as one family's darkness had widened into something larger, a mystery that clung to the surrounding towns, proof that evil was not confined to a single home but could stretch outward through numbers, quiet and methodical, until no one could say where it ended. Maria Carver came forward in 1830, years after she had fled the Lowell house with little more than the clothes on her back. She was a widow by then, her face lined with grief and hunger, her voice shaking as though every word cost her breath. She told the court what she had seen as a maid inside the river house, and the silence that followed her testimony was colder than disbelief. She said the children had been made to swallow ink from glass bottles, forced to gulp it until their stomachs rebelled and they vomited black across the floor. She said Eleanor Lowell knelt beside them with cloths, not to comfort but to smear the stains across their lips, calling it proof that words would no longer betray them. Maria spoke of tongues stabbed with long sewing needles, pricked and scarred so that no prayer could pass clean, so that the only sound that might escape was pain, broken and useless. She told the court she had seen Isaac record each act in his ledger, not with shame but with satisfaction, a tally kept of obedience written into flesh. She remembered the smell of iron and bile, the way the children trembled yet obeyed, their eyes wide as Eleanor whispered that words were dangerous, that sound itself was sin. Maria wept as she described one boy clawing at his throat, choking on ink, his mouth stained black for days. She told them she had cleaned the rags, emptied the basins, carried the needles back to their box while the ledger closed with a heavy thud that felt like final judgment. But the magistrates shifted in their seats, uneasy not because of the horror but because of her tone. They called her hysterical, a grieving woman undone by loss, too fragile to trust with truth. They asked why no one else had spoken, why she alone carried such terrible stories. She answered that the house itself silenced others, that fear lived in the bones of those who had survived, and that her duty was to speak before the last of the children vanished. Yet her words fell into a void. The officials murmured about madness, about widow's grief, about the way sorrow can turn to delusion. They closed their books without taking her account, sealing her testimony as though it were nothing more than an outburst. The town listened differently. Among neighbors, the story spread not in official record but in whispered kitchens and barns. Parents began to glance at their children's tongues when they cried, half expecting to see black stains that would not wash away. Some said Maria's hands shook not from madness but from memory, from scrubbing stains she could never erase. Others turned away, choosing the comfort of silence rather than the burden of belief. Maria herself carried the weight until her death, repeating the story to anyone who would listen, her voice cracking, her body trembling. Yet her eyes sharp with the knowledge that she had seen what others refused to face. She had spoken, but the world had dismissed her. Her words lived on only as rumor, a story told to frighten children into obedience, never recorded as fact. And so the truth of the Lowell rituals remained unacknowledged, buried beneath the charge of hysteria, another voice swallowed by the silence Isaac and Eleanor had always demanded. Yet her warning lingered in the air, like the bitter taste of ink on a tongue, evidence that would not wash away no matter how forcefully denied. In 1844, the parish church was undergoing repairs, the kind of routine work that no one expected would stir the past. Masons were ordered to strip sections of the floor near the east pews where damp had rotted the joists and heat from the stove never seemed to spread evenly. Beneath the Lowell pew, a place the family had once claimed as their own despite never presenting a child for baptism, the workers struck something unusual. Instead of soil or stone, their chisels rang against brickwork set with unnatural care. A chamber had been sealed there, its entrance disguised beneath layers of mortar as if the builders had meant for no eye to ever find it again. The men pried loose the bricks one by one, the dust bitter in their mouths, until the hollow opened to reveal a darkness that smelled of ash and rust. Lanterns were lowered in, and the shapes inside grew slowly clear. Small garments lay folded against the stone, their fabric stiff with age, discolored by smoke and soot. Among them were shoes, scorched and warped, their soles cracked open as if they had once been close to fire hot enough to bend leather. The garments were too small for grown bodies, unmistakably the size of children, and when lifted they crumbled at the seams. But it was not the clothing that silenced the workers. It was the iron. Rings and shackles were fixed into the very stone, some fused by rust, others fused by heat itself, as though fire had been stoked against them until metal bled into rock. The walls bore the stains of smoke that could not have come from any ordinary stove. The chamber looked less like a space for heating and more like a crypt, a furnace meant not for comfort but for ritual. The men lowered their hands into the ash at the base and found fragments too fragile to name, brittle shards that broke at the lightest touch. Some swore they were bone, others insisted they were only stone splinters, but no one lingered long enough to be certain. Their lantern flames flickered as if air itself recoiled. And one worker crossed himself before climbing out, muttering that the chamber was not meant to be opened. When the parish received the report, they made no inquiry into what had been uncovered. The official account noted the cost of brick removal and replacement under a single entry: heating repairs. No mention was made of the garments, the shoes, or the restraints. The chamber was sealed again, this time with fresh stone, the space beneath the Lowell pew restored as if nothing had been disturbed. The garments and shoes disappeared from record, carried off in silence, their fate as hidden as the children who had once worn them. The story spread nonetheless, carried by the mouths of the workers who had seen too much to keep silent. They whispered of iron fused to stone, of shoes that still bore the smell of burning, of cloth that fell apart like old skin. Parishioners began to sit farther from the Lowell pew, unwilling to kneel near a place where cries might once have echoed in the hidden dark. Parents pressed their children closer during sermons, their eyes drawn again and again to that section of the floor, as if listening for something beneath the preacher's words. The discovery only deepened the unease that had clung to the Lowell name. Though the family was long gone from the town, their shadow remained fixed in the parish itself, rooted in the stone. The ledger had already hinted at what they had done, and Maria Carver had already spoken of rituals the world refused to hear. Now the church itself bore proof, sealed beneath its floor, that innocence had been burned into silence. The parish could bury it under the name of repairs. But the hollow baptistry endured as a wound in the foundation, a secret kept by mortar but known to every heart that knelt too near. It was as though the very house of God had been bent into Isaac and Eleanor's order, forced to carry their rituals long after the family was gone. And though the chamber was closed, the silence it held spread outward like heat, invisible yet searing, a reminder that some baptisms are never washed away. It was decades after the Lowell family had faded from the river town that men clearing the rectory attic found a trunk pushed against the far wall. Dust lay thick across its lid as if no hand had touched it for half a century. The hinges groaned when pried apart, releasing an odor so sour and metallic that the men gagged before they saw what it held. Inside was a volume bound in darkened hide, its cover warped, its clasp rusted shut. When forced open, the pages did not crackle with parchment, but revealed something altogether unnatural. Flattened between the leaves were tongues, pressed as one might preserve flowers, each dried and brittle, yet unmistakably human. Their surfaces were scarred with punctures and cuts, as though needled before they were taken, their edges curled like the husks of dead leaves. Each tongue bore a label, neat initials written in Isaac Lowell's unforgiving hand. Some corresponded to his children, others to names no parish record carried, orphans whose disappearances had been folded into silence. The margins of the volume were filled with Isaac's writings, not scripture but his own conviction. Words scrawled again and again declaring silence the truest prayer, the only obedience that could not be corrupted. He wrote of mouths as dangerous openings, gates through which sin escaped. He wrote that cutting away the tongue freed the soul from noise, returned it to purity. To him, each page was proof of a victory. Sound erased, obedience sealed into flesh that could never speak again. The men who found it could not finish turning the book. The sight of those flattened remnants arranged like grotesque specimens turned their stomachs and drove them to shut the cover. Yet the volume itself became a whispered legend, passed among clergy who feared to bring it into light. Some insisted it was destroyed, others that it was hidden deeper in the archives where curious hands might never stumble upon it again. Still, the memory lingered, a rumor more durable than the bodies it recorded. Parishioners said the attic never lost its sour stench even after it was scrubbed, that the air grew heavy there, pressing against the lungs as though the silence of the severed filled the room still. The book carried with it a final cruelty. It proved Maria Carver's testimony had been true. The ink she claimed the children were forced to swallow, the needles she said scarred their tongues. These were not inventions of a grieving widow. They had been preparation for removal, the cruel logic of a man who believed voices must be destroyed to preserve order. Each pressed tongue was a page in his greater ledger, a record not of words spoken but of words forever prevented. The initials scrawled beside them were not names but possessions. Isaac's way of ensuring even the memory of speech belonged to him. By the time the book was uncovered, the Lowell family was long dissolved, their house abandoned, their story blurred by time. Yet the Book of Mouths spoke for them in a way their voices never could. It testified to silence as weapon, to ritual as mutilation, to the madness of order taken past the limits of humanity. It was more than evidence. It was a sermon written in flesh, binding the parish forever to the evil it had once refused to see. And though the book itself may have been buried or burned, its legend remained, a warning that silence can be made holy if a hand is ruthless enough to bind it into Scripture. By 1850, the Lowell house stood like a husk along the river, its shutters sagging, its paint peeled away by years of smoke and damp. The family line had thinned to only a few figures glimpsed in the windows, pale shapes moving through rooms stripped of sound. Where once a cluster of children had trailed behind Eleanor in the yard, there were now only two, and even they seemed spectral, their faces hollow, their bodies stiff as if pulled forward by unseen strings. Isaac himself was rarely seen except when he walked the boundary of the property at dawn, ledger clasped under his arm, his boots leaving tracks that no rain seemed able to wash away. The neighbors spoke of them only in whispers now, for though the family was nearly gone, unease clung to the place like mildew, staining all who came too near. That spring, fires began to spread. First it was the barn, flames licking up the dry beams in the night until they crashed into ash. Then the sheds went, then the smaller rooms of the house itself. Some said it was sparks from the hearth, accidents born of neglect. Others whispered that Eleanor and Isaac were burning what they could not bury, erasing records too damning to leave behind. The ledger was never found after those months, leading many to believe it had been fed to the flames, its marks rising as smoke above the house before vanishing into the black. Each blaze stopped just short of consuming the whole structure, as though someone controlled it, allowing the house to stagger on in partial ruin, scarred but still standing. Neighbors saw Eleanor hauling bundles into the firelight, cloth, wooden boxes, shapes too heavy for her alone, then watching until they collapsed in embers. Her face glowed orange in the dark, her eyes reflecting the flames with a steadiness that unsettled even those who pitied her. Children's garments were seen among the ash, small shoes blackened beyond recognition, fabric curling in heat. No bodies were ever drawn from the ruins, no bones found, yet the smell that carried on the wind sickened those who breathed it, the acrid mix of meat and smoke that clung to clothes for days. People locked their doors at night, unwilling to hear or see more. By autumn, the Lowell line had nearly ended. One child was said to have run into the river, another vanished in the woods. Eleanor grew gaunt, her prayers louder now, shouted to the sky as if daring heaven to answer. Isaac withdrew entirely, pacing the halls of the house like a warden of an empty prison, his face seen only in the flicker of flame from the last of the fires. Some swore he set them himself, striking sparks to corners of the house where whispers once rose, cleansing silence with fire one final time. When at last the structure stood half burned and half abandoned, the land around it hardened. Crops refused to grow in its soil, grass withered soon after sprouting, and even animals avoided its borders. Farmers who tried to till the earth there found their tools breaking, their hands blistering without cause. They gave up quickly, leaving the ground to rot. The house itself leaned, its roof caved in, its windows black, yet still no one dared to finish its destruction. It was left as it was, a monument of charred beams and stone holding within it the silence of the children who had never returned. The town grew around it in later years, but no one built upon that land. It was said to remain barren not because of the fire, but because of what had burned before it, lives reduced to ash, voices erased, memories blackened until only unease remained. The Lowell family collapsed not in one night, but in years of burning, their order consuming itself. And when the last smoke cleared, nothing was left but ruins the neighbors would not touch. A scar by the river that whispered of obedience, fire, and silence long after the house had gone dark. In 1870, the state of Massachusetts passed a law so modest in language that few gave it notice at first. It required every church to keep a census of children, recording each baptism and each death, and to deliver those records to the state each year. To lawmakers, it was a matter of order, a tightening of books, nothing more. Yet those who lived near the Connecticut River heard another story beneath the ink. They knew the law had been born not from bookkeeping, but from whispers that had haunted the parish for decades. Whispers of the Lowell family, of vanished children no one could name, of records lost or never made. The statutes did not speak the Lowell name, but in the silence between lines it was there. Historians later traced the shape of it. Testimony from towns along the river told of children disappearing with no entry in parish registers, of priests uneasy at baptisms gone unperformed, of ledgers containing gaps that no one could explain. The lawmakers in Boston heard enough to act, though they clothed their response in neutral phrasing. They wrote of attendance, of proper recording, of oversight to prevent error. But for families who had watched neighbors vanish, the meaning was clear. No child would again slip unseen into silence. Each birth and each burial would be marked in ink, not left to the whim of a household ledger. The statute carried no fanfare. No debates were held in open halls, no sermons praised it from pulpits. It spread instead like an edict whispered from one parish to the next. Priests who had once hesitated now lifted quills over new pages, writing names with the weight of law behind them. Mothers who had lost children to fever clutched those records as if they were talismans, proof that their grief would not vanish unmarked. And still, in the darker corners of the town, people remembered the Lowells. They remembered fires in the house by the river, the missing faces at windows, the silence that had never been answered. They knew the law was not for the state's order alone. It was a hedge against a family's cruelty repeating itself. Yet the irony clung. The statute's strength was in writing, and writing had been Isaac Lowell's weapon. His ledger had erased as much as it recorded, turned numbers into graves and silence into ritual. The state now sought to reverse that power, to make ink a safeguard instead of a sentence. Whether it would succeed, no one could say. Paper burns easily, ledgers vanish, and silence is patient. But the law stood as the first attempt to bind innocence in record rather than in scars, to mark lives openly where once they had been hidden. Though the Lowell name never appeared in the books, every parish clerk who dipped his quill into ink in 1870 felt the shadow of that family near his hand. The law that followed was not justice for the children already gone. It was only a barrier raised for those who might come after, a line drawn too late, but still worth drawing. In the quiet of their churches, with the candles burning low, officials wrote each name carefully, as if by doing so they could keep the silence that had once devoured a household from ever spreading again. When the last timbers of the Lowell house were finally cleared in the 1920s, the town hoped the land would heal. The charred beams were hauled off, the stones carted away, the cellar filled with debris until only a shallow depression marked where the house had stood. Yet the ground refused to change. Farmers who tried to sow seed there found nothing sprouted. The soil remained cold even under summer sun, damp to the touch as though the earth itself had been scorched beneath the surface. Livestock skirted the borders of the field, balking at the scent that lingered no matter how many seasons passed. Children of the town turned the place into a dare. They crept down into what was left of the cellar, stones slick with moss, and pressed their ears to the walls. Some came running back pale-faced, swearing they had heard faint cries in the dark, not echoes of their own voices, but something smaller, thinner. The sound of children calling for help. Others said they saw shapes scratched into the stone, marks that looked like the numbers Isaac Lowell once carved into his ledger. Circles, crosses, jagged lines, always faint, always half-faded, as if the walls themselves were remembering. The adults dismissed these tales as children's fancies, though none of them dared build on the ground again. The field lay barren year after year, a patch of earth left to weeds and silence. Even in winter, snow melted slower there, leaving a dark outline against the white that locals said looked like an open book. Travelers passing through rarely noticed, but those who had grown up with the story kept their distance, unwilling to linger too close to soil that seemed to breathe with memory. The silence that had ruled the Lowell house had not ended with its collapse. It remained in the ground, in the cellar stones, in the whispers that carried from one generation to the next. The family was gone, their names faded from record, but the hush they demanded lived on, a weight pressing against the land itself. To stand there was to feel absence like a hand on the throat, a reminder that some evils do not vanish when houses fall. They root themselves deeper, waiting, echoing, making sure the silence remains. The last fragments of Isaac Lowell's ledger survive not in a museum or archive, but in private hands. Their pages passed quietly between collectors who do not always admit what they hold. The ink has faded to brown, the leather is cracked and brittle, yet the marks remain clear. Circles, crosses, jagged lines, each aligned with dates, each measured in a hand that never shook. There are no names, no tender words, only the cold geometry of a mind that believed children could be reduced to symbols. The ledger is not dramatic to look at. It has no bloodstains, no torn edges, nothing that screams of horror. It is ordinary, almost dull, and that is what makes it unbearable. Evil here was never loud or wild. It was quiet, patient, folded into routine. It wore the face of a father counting his children as though counting grain, of a mother teaching silence as though teaching prayer. It lived not in shadows, but in the neat order of daily life. This is what unsettles most when the story of the Lowell family is told. We expect cruelty to announce itself in screams, in open violence, in monsters who cannot hide. But Isaac and Eleanor hid their rituals in plain sight. They smiled at neighbors, accepted gifts of eggs and thread, kept their fences straight and their shutters painted. The house by the river did not look cursed. It looked respectable. The children, when glimpsed at the windows, were pale but polite, bowing their heads when spoken to. Nothing about them screamed danger, and so the town went on with its life, uneasy, but unwilling to interfere. Silence grew around the family like ivy, covering what no one dared to uncover. When the ledger is studied today, its cruelty is not in what it says, but in what it refuses to say. No name of Nathaniel, no word of those who disappeared at 9, 11, or 13. Only marks that cut a life into numbers and then stop. The very absence becomes the testimony. That is how Isaac understood evil, less as violence than as erasure. He believed that to silence a voice was to master it forever, and he built his household around that belief. It was not rage that drove him, not drunken fits or sudden tempers, but method. Order turned inward until it became a blade sharper than any weapon. And so we are left with a question more unsettling than the discovery of bones or the book of mouths. If cruelty can hide so completely in civility, how do we recognize it now? What protections can stand when obedience and respectability wear the same mask? The law that followed tried to answer with census and record, with ink that could not be altered in secret. But history shows that records can be falsified, laws can be bent, silence can always find new ways to settle over a house. The Lowell case reminds us that evil does not need chaos. It thrives in discipline, in habit, in the certainty of those who believe they are right. The ruins are gone now, the ground left barren, the cries remembered only in whispers. Yet the ledger remains, and with it the reminder that some of the worst horrors are not hidden in the dark but placed openly on a shelf, disguised as order. If neighbors could miss it then, could we miss it now? What would it look like in our streets, our schools, our homes? Could the marks appear again, written not in quill but in digital code, in policies, in quiet rules no one questions? The Lowell family is gone, but their silence is not. The final question lingers like smoke after a fire, impossible to wave away. What do you think? Could this happen again?